Parakeh Posakeh. Vaydaber Hashem Moshe Lemor. Daber el b'nei Yisrael. Isho. Ki yasum kol chatos odom. A man or woman does any of the chatos odom, transgressions of the odom, limo mal b'Hashem. Meaning you've minimized Hashem. Me'ilah, if you benefit something which is consecrated, that's called me'ilah. Let's see, what is this speaking about? V'oshma hanefesh, and that person was guilty. Limo mal b'Hashem, harei chozev v'kosev kan parshas gezel v'nishma al hasheker. Speaking about somebody steals and swears falsely. Yamur parshas vayikro mol mal b'Hashem v'chichish b'amiso. A person went and he sinned against God when he lies to his fellow. And here it's repeated again for two reasons. You have to confess. That's firstly. A person swears falsely. A person is a shomer. We spoke about a custodian. He takes an oath. Later, witnesses come and say he has the item, whatever it is. So he swore falsely. For swearing falsely, he stole through swearing falsely. He has to bring an osham. He has to bring a guilt offering. And he has to pay a chomesh. He has to pay a fifth in addition to atone for that, taking the false oath. If witnesses come and find him guilty, although factually it's been proven he swore falsely, he does not bring the korban. Unless he confesses through his own confession, he does not bring the korban, and does not add the chomesh, the fifth. What about its gezel al-ger? The person that stole it from a convert who has no heirs, no relatives, that ultimately, when he returns it to the Kohanim. Normally, when you return something you steal, you have to return it to one of the heirs, the children or the closest relative. What happens if there are no relatives? And the Gemara asks, which Jew has no relatives? A person who converted to Judaism, and he didn't have children, doesn't have a family. And he stole and he swore falsely. So when he returns that stolen item, normally the Gemara tells us about the Basra, that when a ger passes away and he has no children, no family, all his assets become hefker, become ownerless, because there's no one who owns them. So now we have a situation, normally, he has an obligation to return that stolen item to the person who he had stolen from, who was the ger, the convert. Now the ger dies. Who does he return it to? So the Torah says he returns it to the Kohanim. The amount of money that he stole, he pays principal plus a fifth, that he gives to the Kohanim, besides bringing the osham, the guilt offering, for swearing falsely. Shunitin l'kohanim. That's the second halacha here. That's Dabrel b'nei Yisrael isho ki asu b'kol chatos ha'odom limo bal b'Hashem. They went and they sinned against God. V'oshma hanefesh, and that nefesh was guilty, but it's only through one's own admission. As it says, of course, he'd have to return the item. But in terms of the osham, the guilt offering, and the fifth, which is kapora, that's only through his own admission, and which is the vidui. He has to have his vadu. We find a similar halacha if a person inadvertently tzchelev, and you have to bring a chatos. It's the fat from the kosher animal at a certain point of the location of the animal. It carries the liability of Misa b'dei Shamayim, which has the liability of, if you do it inadvertently, you have to bring a chatos. What happens if witnesses come and say, he ate chatos, he ate chelev, does he bring a chatos? So factually, and he wasn't aware, and he doesn't acknowledge that fact. He denies it. And they say he ate. He doesn't bring a chatos. It's only if it's through his own recognition and admission and realization. I mean, they could bring it to light, and then if he acknowledges it and admits it and accepts it, he brings a chatos. But if he doesn't accept it, he does not bring a chatos. Bisvadus chatosam asherosu. They must confess the sin that they had done. Ve'eshu Hashem barosho, and he must return the osham, the cause of his guilt first. That's principle. V'chabisho Yosef Olav, and he adds a fifth. V'nosal asher osham lo, and he gives it to who? To the one who had sinned against. Which is what? Which is the one who he had victimized. He swore falsely, and he had stolen from him. Rashi, as a shomo barosho, who akeren shnish ba'olov. That's the principle that he had sworn that he doesn't have. Lasher rosham lo, lemishin chayiv lo. However, v'im elish goel, if the person has no redeemer, he has no family. So the one who swore falsely, and through that he stole from that person, lahoshem v'oshem elov, to return the object through which the guilt came about. Ha'osham hamushav la'Hashem la'kohen. The osham, the theft that is returned, is given for Hashem, is given to the kohen. Ve'levad el ha'kipurim, besides the ram, which is brought for atonement, ashechapelo olav. Shechapelo, through that will be atoned. Rashi. Lahoshiv v'meilish goel shemesa toveh shizbiyah. Shizbiyah, the one who originally imposed the oath on him, which she took the oath. Ve'elu yorshim, and he has no heirs. Losho oshim elov kshenimlach zel isvadus avono. When the person finally came to realization, he's going to confess his sin. Is there a Jew who has no redeemers, has no family? O ben, o bas, o ach, a son, a daughter, a brother, o shar, boser, akorov, mishpachsov, some relative from the paternal side. Lamalad Yaakov, Elizager Shemes. We speak about a convert who dies. He has no heirs. Oshem Mushu Zaker Mechomesh. Lashem LaKohen. Kino Hashem. Meaning, really, it should be given to God, except the Kohen receives it on behalf of God. And it's given to the Kohen who officiates in that particular week, that family. It's his watch. Okay. So that's the gizla. It's called gizlager. When you steal from the convert and you swore falsely, you must confess. Only when you have the confession do you have an obligation to pay the chomesh. The chomesh, the fifth, in addition to the theft, is what is atonement, and you bring the korban. Now, this is interesting. All of a sudden, we're juxtaposing truma to this discussion of a person who swore falsely, and he swears, he confesses, and he brings the korban, and he plays the fifth. We'll see Rashi. Chol truma omer bishmo chi truma makrivin l'kohen. I mean, do you bring the truma? Are you makriv it to the kohen? Valo hu atzum chaza achreo lebeis hagranos. Omatam lo b'shekrivu l'kohen. What do you bring to the kohen? Eilu habikurim. We're speaking about the bikurim. The first fruits. Shuas is Chag Bikurim. The holiday of the new fruits. This you bring it to the Beis Hashem Elokecha, bring it to the Beis Hamikdash. All other tithes that you give to the Kohen goes to the granary, and the granary, Yisrael or the Levi tithes his grain, and he waits there, and he receives his portion, whether it's the truma, whether it's the trumas ma'aser, whatever he receives over there. Yeah. Now, what do you do with Bikurim? If you read the portion of Bikurim, he makes the declaration and he waves it together with the Kohen. But who's the recipient of the Bikurim? Here, the Torah is telling us the Bikurim are given to the Kohen. That's what we learn from this pasuk, that the Bikurim are given to the Kohen. Truma is explicit. The halacha is Bikurim, the only person is permitted to eat Bikurim is the Kohen himself. As the Truma, only the Kohen is permitted to eat the Truma. Bikurim, only the Kohen is permitted to eat the Truma. Eat the Bikurim. We'd once discussed why is Bikurim unique to the Kohen? The word Bikurim comes from which word? Bechor. Bechor is what? The firstborn is a Bechor, whether it's a human being, a male, whether it's an animal of a kosher species, it's the Bechor. Bikurim are the new fruits, the species of Eretz which ripen, and the farmer, as it's growing, he marks it, identifies it, and that's when it's ready to be picked or harvested, he brings it to the Beis HaMikdash. And he makes his declaration on that to show and express his appreciation to Hashem for all that he had done for him. That he'd given this land, this is the first of the produce of the land, that's Bikurim. Bikurim is the first. Now, we find that anything which reflects the first has Kedusha, has innate Kedusha. So I once mentioned Rabbeinu Bachya. Rabbeinu Bachya says in Parshas Kisava, when he speaks about Bikurim, it says, you take Rashis, Bikurim are referred to as Rashis, the first of the fruits, of the grain, of the species. You bring it to where? You bring it to the Beis HaMikdash, which is the choicest of locations. You bring the Rashis to the Rashis. The Beis HaMikdash is the chosen place for the Rashis, for God himself, who's Rashis. He's Rashis Kol, Atu Risha, Atu Achron. And you give it to the Kohen, who's Rashis. The Kohen is also the chosen. He's the elite of the Jewish people. He says you take the Rashis to the location of which is Rashis, for the Rashis, for God, and who's the recipient of it? The Kohen. So there's this commonality. They all share this characteristic of Rashis. We find challah, when you tie the dough, although the grain was what was tithed, but yet if you take that grain and turn it into dough, into batter, the Torah says you have the obligation to tithe the batter. What's challah referred to? Rashis harisosechem, the first of your batter. The first of your batter you must give to the Kohen. That's the first. Pidyon haben is what is the first issue of the woman. That's the pet rechem, the child that opens the womb. The animal, which is of a kosher species, domesticated animal, opens the womb, is naturally kodosh. A person doesn't have to consecrate it to be a korban. It's naturally consecrated. When it passes through the womb of the mother and exits from the womb, it's naturally consecrated. So we see from over here that anything which reflects the profile of the first, which is Hashem's profile, he's Rashis, automatically it assumes that holy status. Bikurim is Rashis. It's Rashis from its inception, when it starts growing. When you tithe grain or fruit, it's of the grain, it's the first of the tithings. It's called Truma. It's the first. But Bikurim is even more than that. the first fruit that ripens, or the first grain that ripens, that's coming into existence, is marked to be brought from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's the rachis in the ultimate. The Jewish people, the first Rashi in Chumash, what says, Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'ha'aretz. Klaus are referred to, quotes a posuk, or called rachis through also. We the first of the grain. We the equivalent of the first of the grain. That just as the first of the grain has innate sanctity, which is the truma, which is given to the Kohen, Klal Yisrael is the rachis through also. We the first of that grain, the first of the tuah. Now, of all the grains, which is the best quality grain? Wheat. The 5 grains, but wheat is the ultimate quality grain. Klaus says rachis tuah also, the first of that tuah. You know, it's interesting. Kabbalah Torah, Hashem offered the Torah to all the nations of the world. We're the only nation that accepted it. Not only did we accept it unequivocally. It's the first. Who is the first person to recognize God on his own? The Gemara says in Brochus that Avraham Avinu was the first human being to refer to Hashem as Adni. Adni means master. The first human being. Adam Rishon, although he understood Hashem was the master, Adni, but it wasn't through his own recognition. He was created, he was the handiwork of Hashem, handiwork, he was in the Gan Eden. He had a level of clarity he naturally understood. Avram, through his own initiative, he came upon Hashem. And because of that initiative, he came to the level of recognition, he's Adni. So the first person to recognize God, to be the master, was Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu was the founding father of Klal Yisrael. That's what he was. So Avraham Avinu had the characteristic of rachis. And therefore he merited that the Jewish people, which are the rachis, they descend from him. And that's why we say in the Shemon Esrei, based on the Pasuk in Lech Lecha, V'yei Brocha, that although we say in Shemon Esrei, Elokei Avram, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov, but how do we conclude the Brocha? B'chol Chosmin, we conclude with Mogen Avram. Even though Yaakov was greater than Avram Avinu, he was the most special of the patriarchs. But the question is, where did it begin? Who has the characteristic of rachis? The first to recognize God. Rachis is Avram. Yaakov, as great as he was, he did not have the characteristic of rachis. It was only as a result of a continuum of Avram that he understood rachis. He understood who the rachis was. He understood maybe at a more advanced level. But who came upon God to be the master? Who was the first? The first was Avraham Avinu. Therefore, because of that, he has the relevance to the rachis, and all his descendants have relevance to that rachis. So what permits the new grain? That you're permitted to eat the new grain. When you bring the Omer on the second day of Pesach, the Omer, which is made of barley, permits the consumption of the new grain. Until then, it was not permitted. However, to use that new grain for the meal offerings of the Beis Hamikdash, for that you have to wait for Shavuos. When the Shtei HaLechem are brought, the 2 loaves of bread, besides the Korban, the animal, is brought, this is a communal meal offering. That communal meal offering was made of the first of the new grain. The new grain that had taken root after the previous years of the Omer. This is the first time we're using that new grain. When they use the new grain for the Shtei HaLechem, now, from that moment onward, the new grain can be used for what? For the meal offerings in the Beis Hamikdash. Until then, you were not permitted to use the new grain for the meal offerings. So for personal consumption, that was the barley offering. That was the Omer offering. To be permitted in the Beis Hamikdash, it's only after the Shtei HaLechem. The Shtei HaLechem was the first time the new grain was used to bring that meal offering.
Just so I understand, when you use the term new,
The
It's
grain
not.
took root after the previous year, the Omer offering.
It's not. It's not really. It's not quote unquote. My understanding, which has now been corrected, was that new meant that took root.
Harvested.
That took root now. So you're saying that anything that takes root after the second day of Pesach cannot be used until the succeeding year.
Correct.
So all that growth had to be stored
Correct.
until the succeeding. So it's the prior year's grain, not the current year's grain.
Right, correct. But let's say you're ready to root. From the time you plant, it takes 2 weeks for something to take root. Said right. You plant and you plant, and now the Omer is brought 2 weeks after that. 2 weeks after that. That grain you planted already took root. So that grain, when it grows, that grain's going to be permitted. It has nothing to do with being harvested. As long as it took root, that Omer offering will permit that grain. But any grain that took root after the Omer offering, let's say it was planted a week afterwards, takes 2 weeks for it to take root. Then the halach is the Omer will not permit that. You have to wait for the following year Omer, and only then is it permitted for personal consumption.
And out of curiosity, so did the agricultural community in Eretz Israel at the time manage their planting so that there was no ambiguity as to sort of when something took root? So
correct. Like today, even today, there's an argument in halacha where the chodosh, something that grows outside of Eretz Yisrael, is it permitted without the Omer offering? Well, no. Universally, wherever grain grows, only the Omer offering permits it. So even chutz la'aretz, the new grain you're not permitted to eat. Today we don't have the Omer offering, but nevertheless, the Gemara tells us, based on psukim, that Gemara Sukkah, other locations, that the moment sunrise comes on the second day Pesach, the chodesh is permitted. If you have a korban, you have to wait for the bringing of the korban. So we have a Beis Hamikdash, we had a Mishkan, you had to wait for that. But after the Churban Abayis, there was no korban, sunrise permits the chodesh. If you have the korban, you have to wait for the korban. Otherwise, sunrise permits it. So today, in Eretz Yisrael, no question, everybody agrees, the law of chodesh has relevance. So in Eretz Yisrael, it's a doraisa. On a Torah level, you're not permitted to eat the new grain until sunrise and second day of Pesach. There's an argument to halacha, and it's a machlokes tanom who to rule like. What about chutz la'aretz? Chutz la'aretz, at one time, most people followed the position that it's only limited to Eretz Yisrael. And that's what they were makel, they were lenient in chutz la'aretz on chodesh. In the United States, it was never a question. Why wasn't it a question? Because until Carter did the grain deal with Russia, the United States had a surplus of 20 years of grain. So when we ate grain in the United States, they always rotated the grain. We were always eating the grain of previous years. So it was never an issue of chodesh, ever. We were always eating the grain from previous years. It was stored in the silos. When Carter emptied the silos and gave it to Russia, sold it to Russia, then it became a question in the United States. Are you permitted to eat chodesh? Because now the grain we're eating is this newly planted grain that was harvested in the previous year, and it took root post the previous second day Pesach. So we all got involved in the question in the United States. Do you have to eat? Are you permitted to eat chodesh? Do we rule like the one who says chodesh only has relevance, is limited? So chutz la'aretz, it's not. Well, no. So then the whole idea of Yoshin came about in the United States. After the grain deal with Carter, Yoshin came up in the United States. Some people were machmir, many people were not machmir. Like in Europe, people were not machmir. Today, people are machmir in the United States. There are enough, because there's enough stored of Yoshin that the bakeries stored enough grain for the year. There's enough Yoshin grain to provide whatever grain we need throughout the year. But if you buy any other grain, you go to a regular bakery. You go to you buy OU Chavke bread, whatever the bread is, baked by a non-Jewish company. It's kosher, but it's not yosher. It's chodosh. So if you eat that bread, you have to rely on the leniency that the law of chodosh only has realms to Eretz Yisrael, has no realms to Chutz La'aretz.
Rabbi, I'm sorry.
There's a morale. The morale explains. The morale of Prague. All meal offerings were of wheat flour. There were only 2 meal offerings that were of barley flour. In this week's parsha, we speak about the Midchas Sota, the suspected adulteress, where she claims that she's innocent. Part of the ritual, she has to bring a meal offering. That meal offering was made of barley, which is the exception to every other meal offering. Every other meal offering, personal meal offering, private, was always wheat, never barley. The suspected adulteress is barley. Why is it barley? So the Mishnah tells us in Soto that the main consumption of barley, it's animal fodder. It's not, humans don't eat barley, they eat wheat. So why is her korban barley? Machol behema. So the Mishnah says, he also maisa behema, even if she did not commit adultery. But how does a woman become a suspected adulteress? She's forewarned by her husband because she's flirting with a certain person. The husband has certain suspicions that something going on. He forewarns his wife, I don't want you to go to seclude yourself, sequester yourself with this man. And she goes and defies his warning. And she spends a night in a hotel room with this guy. Well, a period of time long enough, they could have had relations. And it's witnessed. She was forewarned, it was witnessed, everything else. The forewarning was witnessed, the seclusion was witnessed, and now we don't know what went on behind those closed doors. The woman is off limits, is not permitted to husband until she undergoes this ritual. The ritual of the Sota, which is discussed in this week's Parsha, which is we're going to discuss in a moment, if we have time. Part of that ritual, before she's given the water to drink, which is known as Mei Sota, which you have the rid of the Sota obliterated into that water, she brings a meal offering, which is barley. So why is it barley, unlike any other meal offering? Because he also masabim, because her behavior was totally unacceptable. Just as an animal has no specific allegiance to any spouse, this woman behaved like she has no spouse. As a result of that, the ingredient of that meal offering is animal fodder. The other meal offering, which is barley, is the Omer offering. So the question is, why is the Omer offering? Why is it barley, animal fodder? So the Maral explains, when we left Egypt, spiritually speaking, what was our spiritual standing? We're holding Memte Shari Tuma. We're holding the lowest level. We're holding the point of oblivion. And that's what we had to leave at that moment. Because if we would have stayed longer, we would have gone into oblivion, never to recover. The ascent to Kedusha only began when we left Egypt. And every day was another level of ascent until we reached that special level, the pinnacle of our spirituality, when we were worthy to receive the Torah at Sinai. So we left Egypt as in terms of a human being. What was the purpose of a human being? To contain a certain degree of spirituality. We were devoid of spirituality. We had no relevance to spirituality. We were like the animal. So to signify our spiritual status at that moment, what was our korban? Our korban is barley. The ingredient is barley grain. Machol behema. 50 days later, Kabbalah Satorah, what happened? Atem kriyim odom. Then we assumed the level of odom. Odom, now you're holding at that level that you're able to generate, that's all that spirituality. because you yourself have the capacity of being that spiritual person, which is the equivalent of Adam before he ate of the tree of knowledge. What is the main consumption of what's human consumption, grain-wise? The Gemara tells in 2 locations that human consumption is wheat grain, not barley. So to signify our level of spiritual advancement at Shuas, when we were qualified to receive the Torah, Atim Kriyim Odom. Therefore, that grain, the meal offering of Shuas, the Shtei Lechem, is wheat, not barley, for that reason. We started at the animal level, devoid of spirituality, which is not what the human being was supposed to be. And the descent was to the level of Adam. Adam is grain, wheat grain. Therefore, the Shtei Lechem is grain. Okay? Now, but this is the difficulty. Every meal offering is matzah, not chametz. It's not leavened. There are only 2 menochos, 2 meal offerings, which are chametz. The Korban Toda, you have 40 loaves of bread, 10 of the 40 are chametz. The Shtei Lechem, which signifies the pinnacle of our spirituality, we achieve the level of Adam, it has to be chametz. It's leavened. It seems to be contradictory. I mean, here we're talking about we achieve the level of sanctity, innate sanctity, that we're qualified to receive the Torah, to have the relationship with Hashem, and at that point, you must have chametz. The Shtei Lechem have to be made of chametz. If it's not chametz, doesn't qualify as the Shtei Lechem. Why? That was the question we asked in the past. You know, it's interesting. Right after we received the Torah at Sinai, what happened? 40 days later, we're involved with the Chet Egel. I mean, how could we be? You're at the pinnacle, at that level. You heard the Aser Dibros directly from Hashem. Anochi Hashem Elokecha. Lo yiluch elim acherim. The first 2 Dibros, commandments we heard. 40 days later, we're in a setting which we're a little concerned. Maybe Moshe is not alive. He is alive. They're involved with idolatry, whatever the idolatry was. You know what the answer is? It's a slippery slope. You could be at top of the mountain. It doesn't take very long to fall off that mountain and end up at the bottom of that mountain. But why? You know why? Because we find that even the Ovos HaKadoshim, until they passed away, Hashem did not allow his name to be identified with them. Until Avraham passed away, he was not referred to as Elokei Avraham. Until Yaakov passed away, he was not identified as Elokei Yaakov. Why? Because Al Tamid Ba'atzmat Yom Mosko. Since a person possesses an evil inclination, in a moment, God forbid, a person can become a different person. You could turn your back on God and become something other than that. So Hashem will not allow his name to be associated, identified with a person, unless it's fixed and etched in stone. This is the way it's going to be forever. So once they pass away, Avram passed away, he was who he was, Elokei Avram. Yaakov, once he passed away. Yitzchak, because he was blind, he was confined to the house, he no longer had a Yetzer Hara. And because he no longer was influenced by his evil inclination, therefore, Hashem already associated his name with him even when he was alive. But as long as you're alive, because we possess that evil inclination, which when it starts rearing its head, you never know where you could be taken. So a person always has to be cognizant. Even when you're at Sinai, you reach the pinnacle of your spirituality and your Odom, there's chametz there. And because there's chametz, you have to take every precaution for that reality. Now, there's an Orach Chaim HaKodesh, which we once discussed. If we said Nasa v'Nishma, which Hashem said, Migila Rozel Bonai, who revealed the secret to my children? Why was it Hakofim Harkigis? Why did Hashem have to put a mountain over our heads? That's the question which is asked by the Midrash, it's asked by Tosas, and each one gives another answer. And the Orach Chaim HaKadosh deals with the question. He gives another answer, third answer. So Maral gives another answer, but the Orach Chaim HaKadosh explains it this way. We said Nasa v'nishma, that refers to Tersh v'chsav Tersh Balpeh. At your word, we accept unequivocally. But Hashem says, you know something? What you have to accept, that Chazal, the Chachomim, are empowered to legislate fences, and you're bound by the Torah to abide by those fences. Because unless you have fences, the Torah cannot survive. A human being, which we have these blind spots, and we have these moments, you have to create these fences not to cross those lines. So they said to Hashem, there's no end to it. They'll bind us hand and foot, won't be able to move. They'll create so many fences. Hashem says, without fences, there's no Torah. Man definitely will fail. Therefore, as a result of that, you must accept that Chazal or have the power or empowered to legislate those fences, and you're bound by those fences. That was the Kofel Herkegiyus. It's exactly this, that because we have an evil inclination and we're prone to these distortions of reality in life, therefore you have to have fences to protect yourself, that even if you cross that line, you're not going to cross the ultimate line, which is the Torah law. Therefore, the Shtei Alechem, although we reach the pinnacle, it's Machal Adam, it's for human consumption, it has the Chametz to always be cognizant that your reality is you have to contend with that Achilles heel which we all possess.
Rabbi, so you're saying the yeast and
The Shmoneh
the tastiness, right?
we say Elokainu Tzolashoni Miro. We have a supplication at the end. After we say Vorchas Amo Yisrael Bashalom. But Rabbi Alexandri, of course, is a bracha. He would say this: Ritzoni lasus ritzoncha. Our will is to do what you will. Ritzoni lasus ritzoncha. Ela sor shebiisa ma'akev. The yeast in the dough doesn't allow us to do your will. We want to do your will, but it's the yeast in the dough that does not allow us to do your will. What's the yeast? Yeast is the most intense level of what? Of starter, which causes the bread to what? To ferment, to become leavened. That's the ultimate leavening product. It's the least, that's the Yetzer Hara. Every one of us, whoever you are, we all have it. And we have to all contend with it at various levels.
One might have thought that it would be.
The voice of Yaakov, the hands of Yosef. So the Midrash tells us, as long as the voice is the voice of Yaakov, which is the voice of Torah, and the voice of Tefillah, the hands will not be the hands of Esav. Esav cannot in any way affect you negatively. But if the voice is not the voice of Yaakov, then your dime will be the Esav. That's going to be. It's a Midrash in the introduction to Eicha. So Reb Shimi Choy says, Halochi Esav Sona Yaakov. Rashi cites Reb Shimi Choy over there. It's a halacha Esav Sona Yaakov. What does Reb Shimi Choy have to say? Halochi. Meaning it's etched in stone. It's like it was ordained at Sinai. It's a reality which cannot be denied. Esav Sona Yaakov. Say Esav Sona Yaakov. The answer is the way we read the script. You meet a person. Seems to be he doesn't have any of the symptoms or the characteristics of Esav. Shimon Choy says, halacha. It's halacha, whether you see it or you don't see it, it's a reality. It's only Yaakov. What we see today in the world, in the United States, people have no relevance to whatever that is. All of a sudden, they're ignited a level of Esav Sona Yaakov to the point push us into the sea. Jewish blood means nothing. That's halacha. Therefore, what we see, what we sense nothing. This is part of our Masorah. The same thing. The Shtei Alechem, you could believe you're on top of the mountain. You have no sense of what that is. Of course, it hasn't yet reared its head. But the moment it rears its head, at that moment, you're off the cliff. Would the Jews believe that Sinai, that 40 days later, they'd be involved with a golden calf, and they would tolerate that kind of behavior, even though the rabble are the ones who initiated it? Who would believe such a thing? The Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, always has that ace up its sleeve that you never know when he's coming. And he may hoodwink you and deceive you. Okay.